Okay, so welcome to lecture 11 about steady state economics and degrowth in the lecture series, The Economics of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So in the last lecture, we focused on the fundamental problems linked with economic growth, limits to growth, increased externalities in production and consumption, and the simple fact that you can't have an infinitely growing economy, at least in terms of its material throughput, in a finite environment. We also discussed the fact that economic systems are kind of model of the economy is somehow in a locked-in trap. There's a system dynamic where growth is a goal, money is debt, technological unemployment, growth and collapse. These things reinforce the kind of growth imperative in the economy and are quite difficult to break out of. So in this lecture, what I want to talk about is two broad approaches to addressing that problem of the economic growth imperative, and those are steady state economics and degrowth. And in the seminar, which will happen on Thursday, so that's I want to say the 25th, but I have no idea what the date is yet. It must be the 25th of June. Then we will discuss the relationship between the two. So here I'm just going to describe each of them, and we'll talk about them in more detail in the seminar. So, yep, as I say, two potential solutions. I think you can immediately see by the type of imagery associated with these two solutions, so the economics of a steady state on the left and degrowth on the right, they're relatively different in the way they kind of think about the challenge of economic growth or ending economic growth. And we'll see that this is absolutely the case as we go through the two concepts. Before I talk about the actual notion of steady state economics and degrowth, I want to talk a little bit about this notion of the steady state economy before it became this formal idea through people like Herman Daly and others in the 1970s and 1980s. So I just want to talk about how other economists have thought about this notion of a steady state. So this is just my own thinking on these things, and potentially it's fundamentally flawed, but it's the way I trying to think of it. So I can think about different economists and the way they've thought about steady state economies in these two dimensions. So whether it's a kind of impossible state to achieve, an inevitable state to achieve, or just a normative goal that we should kind of aim for, and whether that state is desirable, undesirable, or simply a necessity, whether it's desirable or not. And we can put different economic thinkers into different boxes based on their position on that. But I think what you can see here, we have David Ricardo, Adam Smith, Thomas Malthus, Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, Karl Marx, John Stuart Mill, Kenneth Boulding, Herman Daly. Many important economists have thought about this notion of a steady state economy before in different ways. So let's start with the idea of a steady state as an inevitable system state. So economic growth can only continue until a country has attained its full complement of riches. The maximum possible level of wealth is determined by the land and climate of the particular country. Growth is a temporary normality which can continue for a long time but not forever. So this is from Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. And his basic idea was that there's a fixed complement of land for a given nation, for example, and that provides a fixed amount of resources, and therefore there's a limit to how much you can grow. Beyond the capacity of the land to provide those resources, then it's impossible to continue to grow. So this notion of diminishing marginal returns of capital based on a fixed asset of productive land, if you like. And so that kind of, in a sense, it foreshadowed some of the kind of modern ecological thinking about things like the ecological footprint. Now, it might be surprising for some people to think of Adam Smith as thinking in these terms, but actually Adam Smith said many things which probably most people wouldn't associate with him in terms of things like justice and kind of the usefulness of markets, but we won't talk about that stuff here. Then we can look at thinkers like Karl Marx. So Karl Marx talked about a steady state economy as a kind of desirable normative goal. So Karl Marx has this notion of simple reproduction, no economic growth. So in other words, a state of the economy which is premised on not creating additional goods and services, but maintaining the stock of goods and services required by a particular economy at any given amount of time. So in other words, kind of maintaining the existing amount of reproducible goods, household consumption, population, social relations, trade relations at some desirable level. And so Marx kind of had this notion that under socialism, outputs and real wages would increase up to the point where the society would decide through some unspecified mechanism that enough is enough. So in other words, we have enough economic activity to meet our kind of needs, and we don't need to grow further. And his critique of capitalism was that, and this is not so dissimilar to the way that Herman Daly, for example, thinks about capitalism. Capitalism is a process of accumulating capital, and it's impossible for capitalism as a kind of ideology to address ending economic growth, because it's simply premised on accumulating more and more capital. In a socialist state, the state itself can decide, well, the people in the state can decide when you've reached a point of enough accumulation and now you just want simple reproduction. Then we can think about steady state economics as a desirable goal from people like John Stuart Mill. So again, John Stuart Mill was one of the founding thinkers of modern economics. He along with Jeremy Bentham kind of created this notion of utility as a way of judging states of the world. And he has many quotes actually on steady state economics, but this is the one that I particularly like. If the earth must lose the great proportion of its pleasantness, which it owes to things that the unlimited increase of wealth and population would expirate from it, for the mere purpose of enabling it to support a larger but not a better or happier population, and sincerely hope for the sake of prosperity that we humans will be content to be stationary long before necessity compels us to it. So already in this, and this is from 1888, there are important notions here about that actually continued economic growth doesn't always lead to a happier population, and that we can actually prosper in a non-growing economy, and that if we don't stop our economy growing, that effectively the kind of ecological limits of a finite planet will force us to become stationary. And he acknowledges that much of the things which make us happy and make the world a pleasant place don't come from unlimited increase in wealth and population. John Stuart Mill actually said some other interesting things about things like working hours and these kind of issues as well in the 1880s, which people miss. But his basic idea was that we should actually be aiming to end economic growth once we no longer need that additional growth. Not so different from Marx in some sense. I guess one of the key things that John Stuart Mill's thought about was notions of progress which weren't necessarily linked to consumption of resources alone, despite the fact that he's a founding thinker in terms of utilitarianism. He had this notion that there are different forms of utility that we can think about, so higher goals of kind of achieving kind of increased educational levels, or kind of achieving your life goals, with maybe higher forms of utility than base needs of kind of consuming more goods and services. So maybe John Stuart Mill also saw a steady state economy as a necessity, but when this first really became prominent, I think was in the 1960s, when you had people who started to talk about this notion of the spaceship Earth. Kenneth Boulding being a great example of this. So economists in particular, for the most part, have failed to come to grips with the ultimate consequences of the transition from the open to the closed Earth. And so maybe this is what distinguishes the view of people like Marx and John Stuart Mill, is that largely their notion was premised on how many goods and services are required to lead a good life. And from the 1960s onwards, there became this shift towards, well, what actually is the capacity of the environment to provide resources for the economy? So it shifted away from just the normative goals of human well-being to understanding the economy as a subsystem of the environment. So again, this comes from Boulding's essay, The Economics of the Coming Spaceship Earth. In advanced societies, and he's talking about economic growth here, this is supplemented very extensively by the use of fossil fuels, because this capital stock of energy, we've been able to maintain our energy input into the system much larger than if we had to rely on the current input of available energy from the sun or the earth itself. This supplementary input, however, is by its very nature exhaustible. So he was talking about the fact that economic growth, the massive increase we saw in economic growth from the last lecture, from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, has largely been driven by exploiting this non-renewable stock, at least in any kind of normal human time span, of fossil fuels, and that this is fundamentally unsustainable because those fuels will at some point run out. And a lot of Boulding's thinking, I think, is influenced by the work of Rogan, who really tried to bring this notion of thermodynamics into economic thinking and the kind of entropy problem. So entropy is this notion of kind of useful energy. And so when Rogan was thinking about economic activity, he was thinking about it in terms of entropy. And basically his argument was we have ultimate means for achieving anything in the world, which is low entropy. So this is kind of which exists in the earth in two forms: there's terrestrial stocks and solar inflow. So we have low entropy energy, useful energy with which you can do work flowing from the sun, and then stored stocks of that low entropy energy in terms of natural resources, and that those stocks may be renewable only in human timescales. And then there are stocks which are only renewable in geological timescales, and they're essentially considered non-renewable. So in other words, the stock of trees in a forest can be renewed within a generation, and therefore they're renewable, and the stocks of fossil fuels take 1 million years to renew, and therefore they're non-renewable. But his point was that all of these sources of low entropy are absolutely limited. The non-renewables, such as oil, are limited to the total amount available on Earth, and the renewables are limited in the rate of use. In fact, you can only use those renewable resources at the rate at which they regenerate. So somewhat depressingly, when talking about economic activity, Rogan essentially made the argument that economies can't simply be stable. In fact, they have to continue to get smaller over time, because of the second law of thermodynamics. So the second law of thermodynamics basically says that entropy increases with every kind of physical action occurring in an isolated system. And you can't decrease entropy, so you can never get more low entropy. Whenever you do some action, you increase the entropy and you decrease the amount of useful energy for doing work. And so his notion of scarcity is rooted in this physical reality of thermodynamics. So he made the argument that all resources are irreversibly degraded when put into economic activity. Not entirely based on the law of thermodynamics, I don't think, but it appears to be true. So whatever you bring into the economy, it's somehow, once you do work on it, it becomes less useful than before you'd work on it. If you take some metal, yes, you can recycle it, but usually at the cost of lowering the quality somehow. And so his argument was that the carrying capacity of the Earth is not simply fixed and finite, but is continuing to decrease, because the more of those kind of ecological resources you use, the less useful they are when they're returned to the environment. And so consequently, his argument was that the world economy as a whole is heading towards some inevitable future collapse. He wasn't clear at what point in the future that might be. It could be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years' time. And of course, you can make the argument the whole universe will eventually die, the heat death of the universe, by all the low entropy energy being used and converted into high entropy energy, which means you just have a universe of a constant temperature and nothing can do anything. But that's not really a major concern for economists, because that is something which might occur in billions of years' time, and it's unlikely that we need to be planning our economy across a 1 billion year timescale. So again, this will be a place to think about questions here, but now I want to move relatively swiftly on to this notion of the steady state economy. So one of the main thinkers on steady state economics is Herman Daly, writing from 1977, his first book on steady state economics. And essentially his argument, and again you can see how this is influenced by the work of Rogan, is that the goal of never-ending economic growth is defined as a conversion of ever more ultimate means, that's low entropy energy, into intermediate means, they're stocks of artifacts, and I'll talk about what he meant by stocks of artifacts in a minute, for the purpose of satisfying ever more intermediate ends, whatever they may be. So in other words, even for Herman Daly, things like education, health, welfare are still intermediate ends towards some kind of desired ultimate goal. But basically we use energy to create goods and services which meet some intermediate ends but not the ultimate ends of kind of whatever that might be for the individual. His fundamental contribution, I think, is to acknowledge that what markets can do is they can allocate resources efficiently, but they cannot determine what the sustainable scale of the economy should be. That there is nothing within the kind of market equation we discussed before which allows markets to regulate the size of the economy. They can make more efficient allocations between consumers and producers and of particular resources, but they can't tell you when enough of the resources are being used so that it's maintained across generations in a sustainable way. And that only government policy can do that. So Herman Daly's notion of economics is a fundamental challenge to kind of neoliberalist ideas that the market is the means by which you can best manage human relations with the environment. His argument will be that no, you need government control. You can allow markets to allocate resources efficiently, but within the constraints set by politics, by society, essentially. So, for Herman Daly, the gaping hole in mainstream economics is this notion of scale. In other words, how big the size of the economy can be relative to the closed economic system in which it's reliant on. So again, this notion that the economy is a subsystem of the environment, all the resources which come into the economy have to come from the environment, and all the waste that goes back into the economy, back into the environment, has to go back into the environment. And so he made a distinction between empty world and full world economics. So when a lot of the kind of fundamental thinking was occurring in terms of neoclassical economics, we think about the circular flow model of the economy, which is just households and firms. This was occurring at a time, the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, where it seemed like the world was vast and full of kind of endless resources, and therefore the size of the economy relative to the size of the environment in which it's embedded was relatively small, and people didn't have to think about these kind of physical limits to the size of the economy. But as we've moved into the kind of end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century, this is no longer the case. And now Herman Daly kind of characterized us as being in a kind of full world economy, where the size of the economy is pushing against the boundaries of what the ecology can actually provide in terms of energy and material being extracted from the environment, and also the ability of the environment to deal with the amount of waste, matter and energy which is being pushed back into the environment from economic activity. And so in a sense it's understandable why the kind of founding thinking on neoclassical economics didn't take into account the kind of environment as being of crucial importance, but now it's increasingly clear that we need to do that. And so basically his argument is that markets can't determine a sustainable scale of our economy because it's based on individual self-interest, and the market's kind of inevitable path is to ecological overshoot and catastrophic collapse. I mean, this is basically the argument he makes. So just to be clear then, when Herman Daly talks about a steady state economy, then he's talking about it based on a steady state of material and energy throughput. So a steady state of the amount of material and energy being drawn from the environment and the amount of waste and energy being pushed back into the environment after it's been acted on in the economy. And he talks in terms of these two key notions. So a stock of capital And he talks about people as being capital as well, and artifacts. So these are essentially goods or buildings or other things which can be used to generate human well-being. And then the physical flow of throughput, that's a matter and energy required to create or maintain that stock of capital. And so basically, people and artifacts are characterized as providing services which require maintenance and replacement. So if you have a car, for example, it provides a service to you, getting you from place A to place B in a timely manner, but it requires energy to power it and more energy and material to build and maintain it. And humans also provide services, so your doctor provides service to you when you feel ill, but they require food in order to maintain that service, and at some point they wear out and need to be replaced, just like cars do. Yeah, so I've already said this. So yeah, the key point being that even a fixed stock of capital still requires a flow of energy and material into that system in order to maintain those capital stocks so they continue to provide the services which humans benefit from. And so his argument is that throughput begins with the depletion of nature's sources of low entropy energy and ends with the pollution of nature's sinks, and so the capacity of nature to absorb the waste products from economic activity effectively. And that's high entropy waste, or higher entropy waste. So based on this kind of very biophysical understanding of the economy, Daly has this notion of kind of a stock-oriented definition of a steady-state economy. So it's an economy with a constant stock of people and artifacts maintained at some desirable sufficient levels by low rates of maintenance, i.e. low levels of, or the lowest possible levels of material and energy to maintain that constant stock of people and artifacts. And that's from the first stage of production, so extracting resources from the environment, to the last stage of consumption, pushing pollution back into the environment. So the steady-state economy, from a daily perspective, is a physical concept. What's being held constant is the capital stock of people and things in a very physical sense. And there's certain non-physical stocks or system components such as culture, knowledge, goodness, ethical codes, art, which don't need to be held constant. They can continually increase. So human well-being isn't limited to the amount of artifacts in the economy, but also these other things which allow those artifacts to be used in a way which generate well-being. So culture, knowledge, ethics, social relations, these type of things. So a steady-state economy is an economy that doesn't grow physically but can develop. And this is not so dissimilar to the kind of thinking of John Stuart Mill when he talked about things which make life good or pleasant. So fundamental to Herman Daly's notion of a steady-state economy is identifying this optimal scale. And so his basic idea is the optimal scale of the economy is when the total net service that economy provides is maximized. So here we can see in this figure here, utility or disutility, so that's a decrease in human well-being effectively, and then increase in production and consumption. So here we have declining marginal utility in consumption. So the first unit of production in the economy creates a lot of happiness, if you like, or utility, and as you create more and more, it declines. And because all that economic activity requires you to extract resources from the environment, then at some point that extraction leads to kind of erosion of the quality of the natural environment on which economic activity is required. So as you have more economic activity, you have a marginal disutility of production, essentially. So marginal utility in consumption decreases and marginal disutility in production increases. And at some point those two things meet, and then you've reached a kind of economic limit where it's impossible to grow the economy further and increase human well-being, because essentially what happens at that point is the amount of additional utility you get from producing one more good or service exceeds the amount of additional disutility you get from eroding natural capital stocks or damaging the environment. And so you want to be producing at this point where you've maximized human well-being effectively. And he would make the argument that it's entirely possible that it's not just a linear relationship between economic growth and disutility, but you might have these kind of ecological catastrophic limits where actually increased production leads to non-linear increases in disutility. So theoretically that sounds pretty simple, right? So we should maximize human well-being. Do we really know where that optimal scale is, where the point at which producing one more good and service in the global economy leads to less well-being than that consumption of that good or service provides? So Daly's position was, yes, ideally we should know that, but that shouldn't be the kind of obsession of ecological economics or steady state economics. So his notion was that ability and viability are more important than optimality. So his starting point is that when we start to think about moving towards a steady state economy, we're already kind of faced with a given stock of population artifacts, which are kind of, he said, historically given. So, you know, this is a situation, there are 8 billion people in the world and they consume a certain amount of resources. And so his argument was that humanity first needs to figure out how to stop producing more population or more artifacts, and then worry about whether that's at an optimal scale or not. So it might be that we're already past the optimal scale of the economy, but rather than trying to get back there first we need to figure out how to make a stable economy. So how we can have an economy which is essentially, in Marxist words, economy of simple reproduction, where it's not trying to create more goods and services but maintain the stock of existing artifacts, and from Daly's perspective also population at a stable level. And then you can think about decreasing it until you're at some kind of optimal scale. So to do this, Daly talks about this notion of satisficing. So stocks should be satisficing. So that means that they should be held at a level which is chosen to provide a sufficient level of good life and is considered to be sustainable for a long run future. So in other words, the idea now is not to maximize human well-being, but saying, okay, what is the kind of level of consumption required for a good life, and that's how much we should use, and assuming that we can do that within some kind of sustainable framework, so that we're not that notion of what a good life is doesn't require 3.4 Earths or whatever it might be. And then within that kind of satisficing level of artifacts or population, or combination of artifacts and population, that throughput should be minimized. So we should be trying to maintain those constant stocks with the minimum amount of energy or material possible. So efficiency then becomes a key notion again. Like, how do you efficiently allocate resources so that the minimum amount of material and energy is required to generate those satisfying artifact stock levels. And so Daly, when he talked about steady state economics, essentially talked about there being 3 rules for kind of steady state resource use, and they're pretty simple. So renewable resources such as fish stocks, soil, groundwater must be used no faster than the rate at which they regenerate, so you don't take fish out of the ocean faster than new fish are produced in the ocean. Non-renewable resources such as minerals or fossil fuels must be used no faster than renewable substitutes for them can be put into place. And so, okay, the argument for this is that there are many important natural capital stocks like fossil fuels, which if we want to be truly sustainable, I guess you could argue we can never use because they're irreplaceable, but that means you're locking humanity out of those resources. So Daly would make the argument that we should use them only at the rate which we can invest that kind of resource into providing renewable alternatives. So you can burn fossil fuels as long as you're using that in order to build wind turbines or solar panels, which are renewable. And then the third kind of ecological perspective of this is that pollutions and waste must be emitted no faster than the natural ecosystems can absorb them, recycle them, or render them harmless. So to acknowledge that the physical size of the economy in terms of drawing resources, so from the first two rules, isn't the same as understanding the physical size of the environment in terms of dealing with the waste which is produced. So it's entirely possible that you can extract resources from the environment in a sustainable way, but the amount of pollution you're creating from that activity is unsustainable because it overwhelms the ability of the natural system to absorb that pollution and render it harmless. So, what are we doing for time? Half an hour already. That's good. Yeah, we can see this type of thinking in action. So this notion of maximum sustainable yield, which we talked about in the fish banks seminar, is exactly this idea that we use renewable resources no faster than the rate at which they're regenerated. And so there is considerable work goes into this type of thing. We think about sustainable forestry, sustainable fisheries, all are kind of premised on this notion. We can think about, okay, are non-renewable resources such as minerals and fossil fuels being used no faster than renewable substitutes for them can be put into place? Answer to that is clearly no. So we continue to use more and more non-renewable resources. So here, coal, gas, oil, all non-renewable, and you can maybe think about nuclear as being renewable, but the rate of growth is not meeting the kind of increased use of non-renewables. And then finally, pollution. So waste must not be emitted faster than natural systems can absorb them. Well, clearly this isn't happening at the moment, but there are concerted global efforts to try and do this. There are certain pollutants, for example, which have been dealt with quite well. So things like the Montreal Protocol on CFCs. So this is the chemicals which cause the hole in the ozone layer. You can think about acid rain, so sulfur dioxide pollution, also something that's been dealt with relatively well. There are protocols dealing with persistent organic pollutants, NOx, SOx, ROx, HN3, all these type of things. And increasingly attempts to manage other sources of pollution like nitrogen pollution, phosphorus pollution, and these type of things. So we're working on this third rule. Climate change, of course, is one of the biggest issues, and we haven't got that under control, but at least policymakers are aware that that's a rule we ought to somehow stick to. So maybe I won't go into too much detail about these slides, but I want to say something about how Herman Daly in particular thought about getting to this steady state economy, partly because I think it highlights one of the differences between steady state economic thinking and the degrowth thinking. So Daly essentially said you need three institutions for a steady state economy. You need an institute which stabilizes population, an institution which stabilizes stock of physical artifacts while keeping throughput within ecological limits, and then a distributionist institution limiting the degree of inequality in the distribution of those constant stocks among population. So again, going back to this notion that a growing economy doesn't deal with inequality because it says a rising tide lifts all boats. In a non-growing economy, the only way to have some kind of equity or fairness is to physically redistribute unfairly distributed stocks of artifacts. And his argument was that these institutions can be built on existing bases of private property and the kind of market mechanism. So fundamentally a conservative view that our economic system needs to be kind of constrained in terms of optimal scale, but then within that you can use kind of traditional economic thinking in order to manage the system. And his idea was that we should do that in a way which is kind of so some kind of societal control on the size of the economy with a minimum sacrifice of personal freedom. So macro stability in the size of the economy, but micro variability about how people use resources and allocate their resources to maximize their well-being. And so particularly in terms of stabilizing populations, stabilizing stocks of physical artifacts, then his argument was that you need to have some kind of quotas for maintaining those two stocks, and you allow efficient allocation within those resources. Now we can already see that the idea of efficient allocation of stabilizing a population is potentially a problematic concept. So I wouldn't characterize this as really being Herman Daly's argument for how you stabilize populations, but he did talk about this type of notion, and it also been talked about by people like Kenneth Boulding. And this is the idea of transferable birth licenses. So in other words, every woman should be given a kind of quota of children they can have, 2.1 licenses, to take into account the fact that not all children unfortunately live to adulthood. And then you have kind of a constant stock of populations based on that quota system. So in other words, you get your 2.1 children, you can use them by having your 2.1 children. It's quite difficult to have 2.1 children. You can use that by having your 2 children, or if you don't want to have 2 children, you can sell your quota or give your quota to someone who does want more children, and therefore again, rationing function of the market means that the people who want children the most are willing to pay the most for them and get to have more children, and the people who don't want them so much can get rewarded by selling their quotas. You can see this is already fundamentally problematic, not just in terms of the way it thinks about allocating babies to people, but also in terms of how you control this. So what do you do with someone who has 3 children? Do you take one of their children away from them and give them to someone else? I mean, what is the sanction for not following that population? It's pretty problematic. And so this is from an academic called Kingsley Davis, who kind of said quite clearly that accidental pregnancies should be terminated, or their children should be taken away and given to childless couples. Reoffending women should be sterilised. Apparently, so these are my quotes in here, these parentheses, but not men apparently. So men can have lots of children, but women are forced to only have 2. It's all a bit dodgy, frankly. Fortunately, there isn't really a need for a institution for managing population. We can see that there's been this massive demographic shift over the last 50 years, where the average kind of fertility rate, so the amount of children per woman, was something like 5 globally, and it's now down to 2.2 or something. Replacement rate being 2.1. You can see this Sri Lanka, for example. They went from 5.3 children per woman to 2.3 children per woman in less than 50 years. They did this because there's been a focus on development, contraception, female empowerment, reduced child mortality, female employment and education. We know what leads to declining fertility rates, and that's essentially these overwhelmingly positive things that we should focus on anyway. We do not need to have birth quotas, I would argue. Nevertheless, even kind of population growth rates which are slightly above 2.1 can lead to huge increases in population just because of exponential growth. So these things are potentially problematic. So here we can kind of see between 1960 and 2010 for 7 countries, in this case in South Asia, but you can look at elsewhere in the world and you see similar patterns where the total fertility rate has declined extremely rapidly to something close to the reproduction rate, but not quite. So currently there are about 120 countries in the world which have fertility rates at or below replacement level. This compares to 6 countries in 1960. So this is a problem which is sort of fixing itself. Then the second institution for resource management. So his basic argument here is that it's physically easier to measure resource depletion than pollution. So in other words, we shouldn't focus on the sinks, but actually the extraction of resources. And so basic ideas here are things like quotas. So you have, how much carbon can be pumped into the atmosphere and still maintain a stable climate. Therefore, you know how much oil and other fossil fuels can be extracted from the natural environment. You set a quota on that globally, and then you use market mechanisms to allocate those resources to those who get the most benefits from them. And there are questions about who controls these things. Do you need a world government and other things? But we can talk about this more in seminars in future lectures. So I will skip over this a bit now because we're already getting long again. I'll skip over this too. His idea about the distributional institution was basically an idea of a minimum maximum wealth or income levels globally. So lots of countries already have notions of minimum wages, at least, or minimum pay. There are increasingly ideas of minimum incomes, but not currently legislated for. Limits to wealth are now being discussed, but don't really exist anywhere in the world, which is kind of puzzling, right? Because it's a relatively small people whose wealth would be constrained, but still that doesn't seem to happen very much. And again, we can talk about that in coming seminars when we talk about some of these notions like universal basic income and why they might or might not work. Just one quick thing to say is that when Daly talked about this minimum maximum income, he wanted to have some kind of gap between the two, because his idea was that there still should be some incentive to incentivize talent, so you should be able to earn more if you do good stuff. So the last thing I want to say is that when you look at the way people think about what's required for a steady state economy beyond Daly's three institutions, you can look at different people, but maybe two useful sources are CASI, so that's the Centre for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. It's a very nice non-government kind of organisation which thinks a lot about how we promote the idea of a steady state economy, and they basically say we need to limit resource use, stabilise population, reduce inequality, reduce working hours, reform a monetary system, and change how progress is measured. And that's not so different from the way other people like Tim Jackson think about it. So he talked about establishing an alternative vision of prosperity, establishing the limits of our economy, investing in ecology, investing in jobs and infrastructure, strengthening social capital, and dismantling the culture of consumerism. So not so easy to do, but at least gives you some idea of what our policy goals should be. Then there are questions of other things which aren't included here, like democratization of the workplace, new forms of capitalism, or whether we need to end capitalism. So there's still an argument in steady state economics whether capitalism is fundamentally incompatible with a steady state economy or not, and I think that's an unresolved discussion. Again, this will be a place for questions. So that's steady state economics and some very quick ideas about policy. The reason I've been very quick on the policy is because the next two lectures are talking about specific policies for addressing some of these issues, like monetary reform and distributional issues and kind of resource caps and quotas and these type of things. I didn't want to go into too much detail here. So the last and kind of newer notion is this idea of degrowth, emerging largely in the kind of 1990s, I would say, and beginning of the 20th century. And it's fundamentally different from steady state economics for a number of reasons. One of them is that it starts maybe in a similar way to Tim Jackson, with trying to redefine notions of progress or what it means to lead a good life. And so it challenges the status quo in an even more fundamental way than steady state economics does. In fact, it doesn't have this conservative notion that we just need to have governments set limits and then we can let the markets kind of manage resources within that, but it looks for a completely different set of social relations for managing our economic system. So this is, I think, a really nice quote, which kind of, for me, highlights the difference. So degrowth is not just a quantitative question of doing less of the same. It is also, and more fundamentally, about a paradigmatic reordering of values, in particular the reaffirmation of social and ecological values and a repoliticalization of the economy. So really, again, trying to move away from this notion that this is just a kind of physical challenge which has to be met. So we just need to set the optimal scale of the economy in terms of how many artifacts we can have, how many population we have, and then manage within that. But really saying, no, what we need to do is society needs to rethink the values which underpin our society and which to some extent drive economic growth. We need to kind of reaffirm the value of social relations and ecological values and not just consumption, and we need to repoliticalize the economy. We need to say that this is a kind of a normative question of what it is to have a good life, and that's a political decision, not some kind of descriptive scientific understanding of how economies work. So it's premised on this notion that stabilization is not enough, that we're already in ecological overshoot, the global economy is too big, and it has to not just be steady, but it needs to degrow. Particularly it needs to degrow in the minority world or the global north, where we are way beyond our kind of fair share of natural resource uses. And so it's linked to this notion of contraction and convergence. So contraction and convergence emerged as an idea in relation to climate change in the 1990s. And this is the idea that there are nations, people in the world who have for many years benefited from more economic activity, and there are people elsewhere in the world who have very little economic activity, and the idea shouldn't then be that each has to change their behavior, but rather we should give the opportunity for the people who haven't had much economic activity to expand the size of their economies to meet their basic needs, and people in the global north need to contract their economic activity until you reach some kind of stable point where everyone has the same access of resources. So originally in terms of carbon emissions, but you can think of this in terms of any kind of ecological resource which might be appropriated from the environment, or any kind of pollution which economic activity might spit back into the environment. So what's interesting about degrowth as a concept is as much a political and social movement as it is an economic concept. So it developed, I would say, in parallel between kind of activists, social movements, political thinkers and economists. So unlike steady state economics, which comes very much from this kind of academic perspective, this is a more bottom up kind of notion. So I mean, one of the points they make, one of the key points, is that if we want to have a sustainable economy, we need to decrease demand rather than increasing supply. The only way you're really going to close that kind of demand gap is by decreasing demand, not by increasing supply on a finite planet. And particularly that acknowledges this notion of the rebound effect, that if you try and increase supply, it means you're trying to use the same set of resources more efficiently. That lowers the cost of production and increases demand. So everything we do to try and increase supply often increases demand at the same time. So it's a relatively young area of study. The first conference was in 2008. There were some kind of pre-conference things happening in the kind of early 2000s, and it's still relatively kind of vague and disputed, and partly it's comfortable with kind of a lack of clarity about the concept. So because it is kind of arising from this notion that we need new ways of thinking, it doesn't want to kind of constrain those ways of thinking by having this kind of dogmatic approach to what degrowth is. So you'll see many different people taking up different aspects of it in different ways. So it's a somewhat muddy field of research, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes this kind of pluralism and kind of freedom is important in terms of inducing new ideas. Yeah, I think I can skip this. This is just basically the idea that that a lot of the original degrowth scholars were influenced by Georgescu Rogan. This idea that we can't have a steady state economy. We have to have a kind of degrowing economy because um, that's the physical reality of increased entropy in any economic system. This is when you see people define degrowth, this is often the description you see. It comes from a paper from 2010 by three of the main thinkers in degrowth thinking, so Schneider, Callis and Martinez-Allier. An equitable downscaling of production and consumption that increases human well-being and enhances ecological conditions at the local and global level in the short and long term. So the equitable is an important point here. And so is this downscaling, and not just of production, but also of consumption. So we already talked about contraction and convergence. And then there's an argument that degrowth isn't an end in its own right. So it's a means towards an end. It's a way of developing policies, practices, behaviors, which lead to an economy of a sustainable scale, which is equitable, and is enhancing ecological functions or ecological conditions. And so it's not just about personal change, although that is a big part of it, but it also engages in political struggle. So again, because a lot of this came from kind of activist behavior, there is this kind of notion of political struggle in degrowth, which you don't get in steady state economics. So it's about, okay, how do we change bad institutions? How do we conserve good institutions which allow us to have this equitable downscaling, or stop us from having this equitable downscaling? So one of the things that I think is particularly interesting about degrowth as a kind of field of research is that it acknowledges, and this is something we talked about in the previous seminar, that part of the reasons that economic growth is this dominant paradigm is because there aren't many alternatives. There's this nice quote here by Roberto Unger. The greatest obstacle to transforming the world is that we lack the clarity and imagination to conceive that it could be different. So everything we know about the world is based on this current system. Our way of imagining things is somehow limited by our current system, and so it's difficult to break out of that. And in degrowth, they're often talking about this notion of imaginary. So an imaginary is something a bit like a paradigm, I guess, but it kind of acknowledges that it's not necessarily just a concrete reality of how things are, but it's also a social construct, right? So imaginaries are kind of defined as the set of values, institution, laws, symbols common to a particular social group, and the corresponding society through which people imagine their social whole. So in other words, it's the set of kind of beliefs and values and institutions about how society is and how society functions. So this is a nice quote by John Thompson, who one of the people who kind of coined this term: the creative and symbolic dimension of the social world, the dimension through which human beings create their way of living together and their ways of representing collective life. And so one of the arguments in the degrowth literature is that we're overwhelmingly locked into a capitalist imaginary about how the world is and what our social relationships with each other are. And so what we need to do is develop alternative imaginaries, different ways, kind of these kind of utopian visions of the future which we can then act on. None of this sort of exists in a steady state economic understanding of what needs to change. There you just need these global institutions, and from degrowth you need completely new ways of thinking about how we relate to each other and how we kind of ascribe values to things, what our institution laws, what our symbolism is as kind of parts of social animals in societies. So related to that is this kind of notion that degrowth is not just a shift that entails a kind of a smaller social metabolism. So for Herman Daly, largely the focus on is how do we decrease the capital stocks and the related material and energy throughput which are required to maintain them. But from a degrowth perspective, it's also about rethinking what our social societal metabolism is for. So to have it do different things. So currently we have a social metabolism which takes in resources and spits out goods and services somehow. But we should think about what kinds of goods and services we want our economy to metabolize, essentially. Maybe it has to have different functions, different structures, provide different things. So this is maybe a somewhat random example, but it's one I quite like. So there is, or was, an economist called Ugo Pagano from Italy, and he came up with this notion of positional goods. So this idea that there are certain goods whose value is not related to the utility you get from consuming that good, but it's related to the distribution of that good among society. So in other words, the utility is determined by what position you are in terms of your ability to consume that. So a simple example would be diamonds. Diamonds, again coming back to the water diamond paradox, which we talked about earlier in the lecture series. So diamonds are largely valuable because they're rare. If you have them, you can show your wealth and power. If everyone had them, they wouldn't have the same value. And his basic argument is that positional goods kind of have this zero-sum utility function related to them, in the fact that if someone has more of them, they provide utility to that person, but at the expense of reducing the utility of someone else who then has less, and therefore their position relative to yours in terms of their kind of status competition has decreased. So you get more, it makes a person who had the similar amount to you before feel worse off than they did. So the total amount of utility generated by that good is zero, effectively. It's distributed differently among different groups of people. And the example he talked about were these medieval towers in Italy, I think mainly around Siena. So you had these kind of lovely medieval towns with 50, 60, 70, 80 towers. These huge tall towers took a massive amount of energy and material to build. People didn't live in them. They served no useful purpose other than as a status symbol. So your neighbour had a big tower, showed how wealthy and powerful they were, so someone else built a bigger tower. And from a degrowth perspective, then we need to kind of take a step back and say not just how do we efficiently allocate resources, but what are we allocating resources for? Why are we building those big towers? Just to show that I have more wealth than you do. So redefining the functions of our economic system so that they're somehow aligned to a new social imaginary. I won't talk much more about, or any more in fact, because we're already at nearly an hour, about degrowth here, but we will talk about these two concepts in the seminar on Thursday, and maybe we'll get a chance to go into some more details about what they are and how they work and whether they're useful. I guess I wanted to say one last thing about steady state economics. So despite the differences between degrowth and steady state economics, in the end they both have a similar goal, which is a sustainable economy within ecological limits. But having a sustainable, a stable economy in terms of material and energy throughput, which is within ecological limits, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to solve this problem of biodiversity loss. So, for example, there's pretty good evidence that even hunter-gathering societies who consumed a tiny percentage of the net primary productivity, so this is the incoming low entropy energy from the earth, from the sun essentially, were able to significantly impact on local species, kind of cause extinctions, particularly of species they preyed on. So the classical example is the Aboriginal people in Australia, who had extremely small ecological footprint, extremely small energy and material throughput, but still led to the extinction of all the kind of megafauna in that continent. And so agricultural societies such as the ancient Mesopotamians potentially had an economy which was within sustainable scale, but they still managed to degrade their soils by irrigation techniques, which led to reduction in wheat production, kind of move to barley production, and finally kind of a complete abandonment of that society altogether because they simply did not manage their resources in a steady state in a sustainable way. However, this only means that human history doesn't hold really good examples of sustainable lifestyle models. It doesn't mean they don't exist. And it doesn't mean that there can't be a steady state alternative to economic growth, which also is able to maintain biodiversity levels. It's just that maintaining biodiversity levels won't be done only by having a fixed and stable material and energy throughput in the economy lower than kind of ecological carrying capacity. So in other words, maybe I didn't say that very clearly, but so I think about the steady state economy as being a necessary but insufficient criteria for ending biodiversity loss. So we're never going to end biodiversity loss as long as we have an infinitely growing economy on a finite planet. But having a stable material and energy throughput doesn't necessarily mean that we will end biodiversity loss either. It will require additional thought about what type of resources we use, how, when and where. But we still need a steady state in order to have those conversations about what should be conserved, how and when and where. So if you're interested in these subjects, well, there's many readings on steady state economics. Maybe a nice place to start is with Herman Daly because he's one of the key thinkers. So there's this paper about allocation, distribution and scale. There's a paper here which is somewhat, it's not actually my favourite paper, but I think it's quite nice because it introduces lots of different definitions and ideas by Van der Berg, talking about kind of different notions of degrowth and why he in particular doesn't think degrowth is a useful concept and prefers this notion of agrowth, but you can read that for yourself. Other things you can read here, so the Martinez-Allier paper is a nice argument for sustainable degrowth, thinking about how this concept developed and how it might change in the future. The Peter Victor paper is about managing without growth from a kind of more steady state economic perspective, and the Herbert Havel paper is about modelling material and energy flow accounting, essentially. So this more biophysical accounting of a steady state economy. As I've said before, what we're going to talk about in the next seminar on the coming Thursday will be a group discussion on the similarities, differences between degrowth and steady state economics, with a focus on what the practical challenges of both approaches are and to what extent those two concepts can or should or shouldn't be integrated or synthesized to some kind of new way of thinking about how we transform our current economic system to one which is sustainable. And then in the next lecture I will talk about some specific approaches to addressing some of the dynamics of economic growth, so technological unemployment, a universal basic income, reduced working hours and debt-free money. I think I'll talk about those. It might be slightly different things I talk about, but something like that. Okay, if you're still listening at the end of this hour, thank you, and I hope to see you on Thursday. Bye.